I know, yet another Arkham retrospective. I feel the same way. I'm not going to waste your time here with a glorified summary of Arkham Asylum like it's an audiobook or something. This is a culmination of notes, thoughts, and contentions on one of my favorite games ever. There is literally no fluff. By the end of this video, I hope something important and real will come out of this analysis in your mind. I'm also not going to pretend this video is 100% based on my own discoveries. The secret for me and many other essayists is that we find new ways of explaining an important idea that has been reciprocated by multiple sources before. We want to spread a specific combination of ideas that we feel is important to eternalize. Truth is, this is also the case for the other sources too. In this video, I'm going to dive into the thought process of modernism and postmodernism, as well as the social pitfalls of corporate safe art. To argue this point, I will be using the Arkham games as a subject of examination. The next sentence I'm about to say will require a lot of context explored throughout this entire video. Batman Arkham Asylum is problematic. The game utilizes a harmful horror trope found throughout many films and games that is explicitly discriminatory towards the mentally ill and disabled. Its depiction of mental hospitals and the treatment of those living within them, a serious real-world topic with a horrific history, is used as a backdrop primarily for aesthetic purposes, simply to convince the player that they are within a gritty, aging environment. While the concept of a rotting, outdated asylum that mistreats its patients is an entirely fitting topic in Gotham City, a setting that acts as a parody of humankind's worst mistakes and weaknesses, the game still fails to carefully craft a meaningful response to the horrors of Arkham, in a sense condoning the environments and actions depicted in the game through the narrative silence. The problematic nature of this rated teen game must be considered if we are going to look at this game as a serious work of art in an extremely influential and growing medium. The point I've just laid out there was a careful simplification of a video essay by Micah Edmonds called Arkham Asylum is Over, uploaded on February 16th, 2022. This was the first time I've personally seen anyone critique the Arkham games as a serious work in the video game medium, a critique you would only often find in film analyses. Game critiques exist, there are thousands and thousands of them out there, but what you'll often find is they take a very shallow look at the game. I am of course extremely guilty of this. I've taken my fair share of shallow looks at Batman media simply because of my bias. You can tell the difference in my approach towards critiques for certain works. I'm extremely harsh in my criticisms towards The Dark Knight, for example, because my knowledge of the many less realistic depictions of Batman shows me how much more you can do with the character in comparison. Similarly, my critiques of Batman Arkham Knight were far deeper in philosophy for both game design and narrative, because the game came out in a time where my childhood nostalgia was fading away and I was consistently disappointed by my favorite properties. Micah Edmonds' video revealed to me that our biases are far stronger than you might think. That we all have these biases, no matter how quote-unquote open-minded you believe you are. Before I continue on, if these types of videos are something you enjoy, meaningful analysis of art, or the process of creating it, consider subscribing to both this channel and my second channel where I cover broader topics beyond Detective Comics. This channel, of course, will have similarly styled content, but it is specifically geared towards Batman-related stuff. I really need your help getting to 1,000 subscribers on my second channel because I cannot monetize any of my content there until I have that number. I highly recommend watching my analysis of Andor or the Fallout show. In Batman Arkham Knight, one of the more interesting critiques I came up with is focused on the conception of Founders Island. Level design has always been very interesting to me. It is one of my favorite things to discuss. The best level design is not just visually appealing or facilitates pleasing movement, but it is also a solid narrative foundation. Batman Arkham Asylum's many environments aren't just aesthetically rich, but there's a lot of implied history behind it. Even in Arkham City, the level design often reflected the broader concept of the game. This is a game about a city neighborhood turned prison, and so a lot of the environment is showcasing how this has impacted different parts of the city. Arkham Knight has the weakest level design concept of all of the games. It's literally just Gotham downtown, a location even less interesting once the citizens of Gotham are removed from the picture. Maybe this is why they needed a founder, something to add a little bit of variety to the game. The narrative reason behind Founders' inclusion isn't really clear. The only theme I can really pull from it is the idea of Gotham's future, a common phrase found on Founders Island adverts. But in the actual story, the only meaningful thing said about Gotham's future is that Batman won't exist anymore. When you look deeper into the concept, Founders either proves itself nonsensical or makes Bruce Wayne out to be a problematic figure, which is conflicting with the heroism the game consistently implies. Bruce Wayne's Wayne Foundation is publicly endorsing and funding the demolition of Founders Island to create a gentrified, corporate-oriented district. Many signs throughout the island hint at civilian resistance against the destruction of historic districts. This corporate, capitalistic decision is going to force thousands out of their homes and businesses. Also, that Gotham can have a new super mall. At the same time, Wayne Foundation is spearheading the restoration of Arkham City. Bruce Wayne campaigned against the construction of the prison because it would be destroying a historical district of Gotham. The company is also simultaneously renovating Old Panessa Studios, a front for Batman's secret base. So which is it, Bruce Wayne? Do you hate poor people in historical neighborhoods, or are you using them for public reputation points? Either way, Wayne Foundation sounds like a deeply confused, problematic corporation. A corporation that owns huge swaths of the city. This is the company our main character is running. Without any substantial narrative beats on this topic, I can only assume Bruce Wayne supports this activity. In fact, the company funds his many militaristic, highly illegal toys in secret. Now look, this conflict I have pointed out, seemingly caused by Rocksteady's negligence, actually sounds like a really cool plot point, yet the game never does anything with it. Rocksteady had a chance to create a narrative arc about gentrification and the role of big corporations, could have commented on the ethics of Gotham's egomaniac savior being a privileged billionaire. The setup for Hush in Arkham City could have been a perfect way to induce these themes in Arkham Knight. Hush could have utilized Bruce's hypocrisies against him. Instead, we got a narrative disconnected from reality about an incoherent Joker virus, a resurrected Robin we never heard about with a name that makes no sense, a main villain with conflicting plans and a weak motivation to destroy Gotham, and a semi-interesting dynamic between Batman and his hallucinated version of Joker. It's clear, especially in the first Arkham game, that the majority of Rocksteady's staff either don't engage with or don't know about the real-life implications and inspirations underlying these games. Maybe this is because they believe these Batman games are inconsequential, that Batman is a fantastical comic book character that isn't really meant to be taken this seriously. That these stories are simply for fun entertainment, just completely apolitical. Yet, I can't entirely believe that, because some level designer puts in a sign depicting anti-gentrification protests. Some writer constructs a backstory exposing the barbarity of electroshock therapy. Another writes about the manipulation of a desperate father trying to please his daughter diagnosed with cancer. Most damning, someone brought up a story about a warden's ego being suffocated into insanity by the mentally insane due to the murder of his own family. Arkham Asylum directly discusses genocide of the mentally ill. Arkham City directly discusses the genocide of criminals. Rocksteady, what are these games about? If you are a true fan, you are rewarded with some intriguing stories with themes that have real-life implications, yet you are still subjected to the primary content sold to the normal audience. Content that is significantly safer and as a consequence ends up incriminating itself. Batman Arkham Asylum specifically depicts some serious elements that leads to its problematic nature. It depicts a mental hospital in the modern age that contains structural features outdated by over 100 years. This is on top of the facility being greatly unsanitized and infested with pests, likely for many years now. It depicts absurd and outdated medical practices that in the best case scenario would result in the closure of the facility and in the worst case result in dozens of criminal trials of the doctors and staff working there. It depicts prison-like containment practices, many of which involve electrocution, which can cause permanent damage. It depicts human remains in many parts of the asylum that are routinely ignored by the staff. It depicts the mentally insane as primal monkey-like creatures in straitjackets and inhumane headwear. The mentally ill are consistently referred to as animals and freaks. In real life, if this facility was outed to the public, this would become the trial of a century at the level of the Supreme Court. Now, by itself, these facts don't actually mean anything yet. Actually, it's a great setup for an insane story. What makes the game problematic is its response and utilization of these elements. Unfortunately, the game seemingly fails to realize its own implications. For a so-called hero who has delivered many people to the asylum over the years and has a secret Batcave on the island, right under the suicide cliff by the way, Batman is weirdly quiet about his thoughts on all of these things. Not only does he fail to care about the inhumane conditions here, but his actions lead me to believe he condones and participates in the same behavior. He bears no ill will towards the police chief, the doctors, or the warden. He somehow doesn't even notice how horrific it is here. And if he did, it might explain how the villains and inmates feel. It might explain why they rose up in the first place. The most notable example of this is his physical reaction towards the mentally insane. The brutality is simply unwarranted. Even if the player somehow avoids beating these guys to a pulp, their choice is not at all accounted for in the game. The developers fully intended this to be a tricky enemy type for the late game that is meant to freak you out. Batman's attitude the entire game is my way or the highway, despite knowing full well how corrupted this environment is. Batman is, I guess, forced to hit Bane with his car and nearly kill him despite being a lab rat and likely tripping on Titan without his consent. Batman is so upset that Poison Ivy decides to leave her cell where she is subjected to isolation and basically torture because she cannot use her powers. Then he just has to trap Killer Croc in a pit even though he invaded his own home, a place where he is completely cut off from human contact despite being a human himself. He repeatedly beats up the quote-unquote animal inmates from Blackgate who are out of their cells. What does Batman want them to do exactly? Stay there in a lockdown facility that may not come back into control for days? Does he want them to just sit there and starve to death? Why? At no point does Batman ever attempt to de-escalate the situation. The answer is always violence every time. Everyone in Arkham Asylum deserves to be brutalized, either because of past criminal charges or because they are mentally ill and cannot be controlled by nature. Of course, I know what a lot of people are thinking right now, and I'm going to get to it. A lot of this is because Rocksteady thought about the gameplay first, but then put very little thought into its implications. And that's fine, that doesn't make the game horrible or bad in any way. Again, it's one of my favorite games of all time. What I'm trying to argue here is that there is a better version of this game that exists out there that actually explains these implications. What I found when watching Micah Edmonds' video was a feeling of discomfort. Arkham Asylum is easily my favorite Arkham game because despite that narrative shortcoming, the environment is still the most interesting and dense out of the series. The reference material was an amazing pick to revitalize DC in the video game market. Unfortunately, great reference materials means you need a lot of care, and this is where Rocksteady just dropped the ball. But it's something we never really noticed originally. This critical look at the ethics behind Batman Arkham Asylum is, I think, a postmodernist stance that people are not inherently trained in. People think more about if a game is fun way before they even talk about what it really means narratively. Modernism and postmodernism are often used as a somewhat overarching artistic term, primarily about the elements we care about when attempting to objectively characterize art. Merriam-Webster Dictionary describes modernism as a modern artistic or literary philosophy and practice, especially a self-conscious break from the past and a search for new forms of expression. Modernism is simply a term for the art philosophy surrounding the 20th century. Art that is particularly simple and not something we would see as deep in any real way. Modernist movies like that of a Western have a clear-cut villain and hero. The earliest Westerns often include Native Americans as an almost spiritual threat to society, but they would never really discuss why or how. These stories weren't interested in critical thought or making the audience question their surroundings. They were simply for entertainment and to solidify the values of the time. Postmodernism was the response to this philosophy, coming in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. It would describe these westerns as unethical and shallow, that these films were manipulations of the real world in a wasteful way. A postmodernist story has more relatable, flawed human characters. The world isn't perfectly clear-cut into black and white moralities, and the ending isn't always happy. In a way, the postmodernist story is a response to the American lie that older stories propped up, that the bad guys would be defeated and that the good guys would be rewarded, that justice was innate and pure. Postmodernism throws away the idea that things are concretely good or bad and that things inherently matter. The video essay, Why Do Movies Feel So Different Now? By Thomas Flight explains everything I just said in far more detail. It's a really insightful watch. Throughout this video, so far, I have been criticizing the Arkham games through a postmodernist lens, a deeply critical lens. The modernist lens was how I viewed the game as a kid. I didn't care about what all of this meant, I just liked that it was creepy, mysterious, and contained all the cool, colorful villains I could only see in the comics or a Lego game. But coming back as an adult, you begin to ask more questions. You begin to ask why things are the way they are. Nevertheless, my outlook on the game doesn't just stop there though. It would be odd if it did, because you could just watch Micah Edmonds' video and be done. I actually have a positive analysis of this game, one that attempts to go beyond postmodernism. The previously mentioned video by Thomas Flight breaks down the evolution in film from modernism, postmodernism, to finally metamodernism. Metamodernism is a response to postmodernism. Postmodernism is bleak. It hopes to show the world as it is. It hopes to tear down all of the lies and grand manipulations of the world and expose it as this meaningless, depressing existence. I feel like this was their way of airing out their frustrations. These stories are meant to be therapeutic. Sometimes escapism isn't just about fun. It can take the form of fictional characters expressing the emotions you cannot show in real life. Anger, sadness, trauma. Like, why do you think everyone likes Ryan Gosling right now? Alternatively, metamodernism takes this a step further. It doesn't just end at the negative emotion targeted at the world. It attempts to reconcile those emotions and/or provide a solution to the inherent problems of society. To me, the metamodernist is attempting to find what's truly valuable about art, not just if it is authentic, but if it impacts people in a positive way or pushes society forward. I don't mean this in a sense that the audience should come out of the experience with a big smile on their face, but just that the work has some kind of helpful knowledge that informs progress. Sometimes in postmodernist art, simply begging the question can be enough to inspire, but some can also spread misplaced nihilism. At the end of the day, all of these different types of experiences, modernism, postmodernism, and metamodernism, all have their place in society, and they aren't all inherently good or bad. Batman Arkham Asylum is a problematic game due to it containing references and topics that require a postmodernist, but that's not the whole story. Inklings of the source material can be found throughout the game, which is meant to be a sort of adaptation of it. Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth was released in 1989, written by Grant Morrison and illustrated by Dave McKean. I hope I pronounced that right, oh god. When you read this book, the creepy visuals and symbols seen in the game are given far more context. For example, the beetle symbol branded on many of the buildings is a direct reference to the book, where Amadeus's dementia-ridden mother ate beetles to protect herself from the evil forces in the house. Amadeus Arkham's entire story is adapted from this book, which of course the book does a better job of telling it. This may be one of the best graphic novels I've ever read for obvious reasons. Not only does it take a deeply philosophical look at Batman's character and existential ideas about sanity and the human condition, but is illustrated in such an expressionistic and unique way. It's hard to tell how this book was illustrated. It appears to have real images mixed in with drawings. Each page is sort of a puzzle, which panel to read first, who is talking, what is going on. The drawings express how the characters feel, and the topography of their dialogue perfectly represents their personality. Batman is never truly seen in full, always in shadow. Joker's body contorts and changes. He's sometimes towering, sometimes normal. Clearly, Arkham Asylum is a postmodernist work. It fully shatters the paradigm we often see in Gotham City. Technically, everyone is a villain in this story. The doctors, the patients, even Batman. They are all illustrated to be evil in some way. Most of all, it brings light to the profession of the psychiatrist. Obviously, this story is an over-exaggeration, but you can only assume the mission these people face is one not many people on Earth can handle. In the beginning of the book, Batman immediately questions the methods of the doctors, irritated that they are fine with patients like Joker being free to roam the asylum. But the doctors put Batman in his place. What does he know about treatment? After all, Batman's primary treatment is physical abuse. Going back to the game, in the third Scarecrow hallucination, the roles are reversed. Batman is now the patient being sent to Arkham, and the villains are the doctors. After being shot by Joker, Batman digs himself out of his own grave. In this first calm area, you can find 4 versions of Batman. All of them have become delusional. The deepest aspect of this game's main story is the heavy implication that Batman fears becoming a patient at the asylum. Clearly, he believes there is some capacity at which he could lose his mind. His brutal abuse of those at the asylum, his agitation and impatience towards villains, and his flat bullshit tone he puts on in front of everyone is very likely the result of him realizing how close he is to being just like them. This explanation takes Bruce from being a complete sociopath to a tragic, sad abuser with lots of self-hatred. Batman in this game is a horrible person, and the game does try to tell you this, but for some reason this theming could not be the center of the plot. It had to be hidden away in little details and optional content. In complete opposition to this character beat, probably the most interesting story element you could find, the game ends in a very modernist way, with 0 repercussions for the main character. Joker is attempting to make the story about something more, about the abuse of the asylum and Batman's role in it, but our hero wants none of it. Batman solves the problem once again with his fists, beating Joker and his crew into submission. A cheerful soundtrack plays and Batman flies off into the moonlit sky. All of this, the discussion of Rocksteady's broader issue of unfocused storytelling, the discussion of problematic depictions, the role of reference material, and the inklings of postmodernist themes in the game, it all builds into my meta-modernist thinking about this. Rocksteady had a difficult task, reviving DC in the video game space. To do this, they decided to adapt a disturbing, dark, and uncomfortable book, one that people could take a little bit seriously. They decided they were going to make a game about the mentally insane and make the main character borderline mentally ill. WB somehow accepted this idea, but in the end, the game was clearly toned down. Rocksteady had the opportunity to hit on very personal concepts in a rising medium. A medium in which we've already received very serious, groundbreaking narrative stories, but either due to their own intuition or that of WB, they softened their strike. And it kind of makes me think, is some of the stuff that is in Arkham Knight, the serious rated M stuff that they want to put in the game, was that leftovers from stuff they couldn't implement in Batman Arkham Asylum? Right now, Arkham Asylum has some sensitive topics within it based on a book with highly sensitive topics as well. The book and the game are likely seen by some honest people as problematic depiction of mental illness. But despite that, Arkham Asylum is about something real. Its depictions, despite flying over some people's heads, still raise significant questions in others. Sure, it has its modernist motifs, it has the cinematic shots of Batman punching criminals, black versus white, but the game still provides symbols and visuals that make the audience wonder, even if the ultimate message was never properly constructed. You don't come out of the spirit of Arkham Quest talking about how fun it was. No, you think about how horrific the crap you just listened to was. You wonder if this is something real people believe. You wonder about who's right in that story. You wonder if Amadeus Arkham was justified or if he was a criminal. What would you do if your wife and daughter were murdered by your own patient, one you've dedicated years to curing? It makes you wonder whether some people simply cannot be fixed, like the Joker, like maybe Batman. Even though the story is highly exaggerated, highly dramatized, it still begs a question as opposed to begging none at all. As a child, Batman Arkham Asylum was my first real look into Batman lore, and it would take me many years to ask myself these questions. The game simply started out as a fun yet creepy game to explore, but eventually it became a basis for how I understood Batman. As I grew older, I began to become more conscious of the real world and its politics. I started to inject and recognize the politics within Batman's stories. I started to see Batman's relevance, how his stories were an outlet to expose corruption and hatred that existed in the real world, how comic writers were trying to communicate beyond just pedantic violence beneath the surface. Eventually, I came to question whether Batman himself was a good person, whether his archetype as a vigilante billionaire was problematic. And while there were plenty of people who misinterpreted Batman, seeing him as their hyper-masculine mascot, I began to recognize the opposite. Batman to me is a flawed individual, a postmodernist hero, someone who has the ability to do horrible things but also hopefully grow from them. Whether or not the developers meant it, I began to see Arkhamverse Batman, like I see many other versions of the character, to be a cautionary tale. I began to recognize Batman's place in Gotham, someone who so desperately wants to help, but is unfortunately feeding the flames of the socio-economic problem, one that Batman cannot solve simply with his fist, not alone. His allies constantly come and go, realizing quickly what type of man he really is, one who is extremely noble yet dangerous, primarily to himself. Underneath the dramatic fights and layered gameplay loop, the Arkham games build up an interesting story about two people obsessed with each other, a relationship no one but them would understand. Batman tries desperately to escape his own trauma through focusing on crushing crime in Gotham, yet that one man will always be in the back of his mind, an outburst contained. Batman's hatred towards crime, his violence, his ignorance, yet his constraint can all be explained by his greatest fear, that in another world not so different to this one, the Batman would be rotting away in Arkham Asylum with the rest of the criminals. Batman Arkham Asylum, an extremely entertaining game with problematic depictions and thought-provoking themes, ultimately resulted in a video essay being created that exposed the real-life consequences of the game. It expanded upon the history of mental institutions that the game failed to elaborate on. It was a wake-up call not only about the nostalgia complex of childhood stories, but also about the nature of mental illness in the real world, something we isolate in buildings far away to hide from the public consciousness. Arkham Asylum is Over would have never existed if the game didn't make a mistake in the first place. We are human, we can endure making mistakes, we can learn from them, we can learn from the mistakes of others. We can be influenced to teach each other to be better through our collective mistakes. This is the way of progress, that's how it works. It's ultimately the point of Batman, I think, understanding justice not through retribution or vengeance, but through patience and trust, to realize that justice cannot be enforced, it has to be understood. Arkham Asylum is a problematic game, but it is at least about something real, even if hidden. I'd much rather encounter stories that are like Arkham Asylum than witness stories become about nothing, slowly teaching us to care about nothing. Stories we can't question, stories we can't even learn from, stories that are just nothing. The question you and I may be asking now is, why does the problematic nature of Arkham even matter? The next step would be to prove that the representations in the game have misled people in some way despite being fictional. Do people truly understand where the fiction ends and the real-life influences begin? Do some people really think mental institutions are like this? I'm not sure I am capable of answering this in a statistical way, but I don't think it should just be completely dismissed. The case here is much harder to prove than, say, Call of Duty, which continues to confuse the youth about morality and ethics of war in a far more direct way. Superheroes are a lot more vague. They are obviously supernatural. They are beyond real life. But does that mean they have no relation to real life? Of course, some people will argue that representation isn't important at all, and I would say that's probably because they personally aren't being misrepresented in the media. Thousands of people are stuck in mental institutions every year. Some describe it as worse than prison. Not because it's a madhouse like Arkham Asylum where there's rats everywhere and crazy people running around, but because they have no set release date, and convincing doctors of your rehabilitation is an extremely difficult task. If one of these people played Arkham Asylum, I don't think they'd appreciate it. There's lots of great stories to pull from real life situations, but Rocksteady chose to instead make up most of it, which would be fine if Batman wasn't called the most realistic superhero, if the game wasn't designed to look so realistic. In that way, there is confusion on what is fiction and what is meant to be taken seriously. And that's where I would hope a writer or designer puts a little bit of thought into the ways people could take the wrong message from the game. What I'm asking for here isn't a systematic policing of problematic depictions in video games. I'm simply asking that they try a little bit harder and think about a broader range of people beyond themselves. At the end of the day, I think putting in this effort and nuance into the story would add to it. It would make it better. It would make it more than just another superhero game. If they remade Arkham Asylum, this is what I'd want. A deeper look into this twisted world. I would want a more cohesive experience that brings the game to its full potential. I'm glad Arkham Asylum exists. I appreciate my time with it and the conclusions I've come to, and I'd want that for all of those led astray. But until then, this is the last Arkham Asylum video essay.